In 1972, a linguist working in far north Queensland sat down with a group of Aboriginal elders to record a story, one that had been passed, mouth to mouth, down through the generations. It was a story about two young men, a broken taboo, and a furious rainbow serpent that tore the earth open beneath an entire camp of people. On the face of it, it sounded like exactly what you'd expect. A dramatic morality tale about sacred law and supernatural punishment. A myth. Decades later, geologists studying that exact same patch of country drilled down into the ground and pulled up cores of sediment. And what those layers told them stopped the myth reading dead. Because the story was not a legend dressed up as memory. It was a genuine eyewitness account of a volcanic eruption, and it had been kept alive accurately for something close to 10,000 years. This is Ancient Aussie history, where we go looking for the parts of this country most people never find, and the ancient story most of us were never taught in school. Subscribe now, and if you'd rather listen, every episode is also a podcast on Spotify. Link below. Because this is one of the clearest examples anywhere in the world of the oldest living memory in a culture and the hard evidence of modern science turning out to describe the exact same morning. 3 quiet lakes. The lakes in question sit on the Atherton Tableland in far north Queensland, roughly 40 kilometres south of Cairns, Lake Eacham, Lake Barrine and Lake Euramoo. To a geologist, they are maars, a specific and relatively rare kind of volcanic crater. And the way a maar forms is the key to this whole story, so it's worth understanding. A maar is not built up like the classic cone-shaped volcano. It is blown down. When rising magma meets groundwater underground, the water flashes instantly to steam, and the pressure detonates in a single violent explosion that punches a crater straight down into the earth. No mountain. No slow lava flow. Just a sudden, catastrophic blast, and then a deep hole in the ground that, over time, fills quietly with water, leaving a lake with no visible connection at all to the violence that made it. And today, that peace is total. All 3 lakes sit cradled in dense, ancient rainforest, their waters deep and still and blue, ringed by towering fig trees growing right to the edge, home to freshwater turtles and platypus. Lake Eacham drops to around 65 metres deep and has no streams flowing into it or out of it whatsoever. It is a closed, self-contained system, fed only by rainfall, losing water only to evaporation and slow soakage into the rock, its level rising and falling by several metres between the wet and the dry. Lake Barrine, the largest, is roughly a kilometre across. Lake Euramoo is the smallest of the 3. Walk the rainforest paths around them today and nothing. About that glassy surface hints at what the ground beneath your feet once did, pinning down the date. For a long time, the age of these craters was known only in the broadest strokes, part of a wider volcanic field that had been active across an enormous span of geological time. It was only when researchers drilled straight down through the layers of mud and ash settled on the bottom of each lake, reading the sediment like the pages of a book, that they could pin real dates to the eruptions. And the dates are remarkable. Lake Eacham's eruption is now placed at a little over 9,000 years ago. Lake Barrine, the larger crater, formed earlier still, somewhere between 15 and 17,000 years in the past. Numbers like that would be a footnote in a geology paper, and nothing more, except for one thing. There was already an account of these eruptions sitting in the world. Not in any scientific journal, but in the oral tradition of the Ngudjinji and Yidinji peoples, the traditional custodians of this exact stretch of country. And that account had been there, in all likelihood, the entire time. The story told in forensic detail. If you've made it this far, here's the part that ties it all together. And it's the part that matters most. Subscribe now if you want more of this series, because this is where a legend turns into testimony. According to the story, recorded from multiple tellers across different decades, 2 young men, newly initiated, broke a taboo that forbade them from hunting before their initiation was properly complete. Digging for witchetty grubs at the base of a tree held sacred, they angered the rainbow serpent, one of the most powerful and feared figures across Aboriginal spiritual tradition right across the continent. And what followed was described not in vague, dreamy terms, but in specific, almost forensic physical detail. The ground beneath the camp began to shake and to roar like thunder. A wind swept down as though a cyclone were coming. The earth itself twisted and cracked open. And even though it happened in the middle of the day, the sky turned a deep blackish red, a colour the witnesses said they had never seen before. Then the ground gave way entirely, and the camp and the people in it were swallowed into the earth. The place where they had stood becoming, from that day, a body of water. Now read that against the geology. A wind sweeping down ahead of the blast, a rumbling, roaring ground, an earth that cracks and twists, a sky turned an unnatural reddish black by ash and gas, and a specific inhabited spot that becomes permanently a lake. Every single one of those details lines up precisely with what modern volcanology understands about how a phreatomagmatic maar eruption actually behaves. The wind, the ground shock, the ash-darkened sky, the crater that fills with water. This is a description of an event that the Aboriginal communities of this region had no scientific vocabulary to explain, and yet preserved with startling physical accuracy across something on the order of 400 generations. Sit with just one of those details, the sky. A person watching a maar eruption in daylight would see the sun blotted out by a column of ash and steam, the light filtering through it, turning a sickly, deep red-black that nobody in an ordinary lifetime would ever otherwise witness. The storytellers didn't know why the sky did that. They had no concept of an ash column or of sunlight scattering through volcanic gas. But they noticed it. They marked it as unprecedented. A colour never seen before. And they carried that one strange, true observation down through the generations without ever understanding the physics behind it. That is not how invented myths behave. Invented details tend to be symbolic and vague. Real observations are specific and often unexplained by the people who kept them, which is exactly what we find here. Before we go further, one thing that ties directly into a discovery like this. I've put together an ebook called The Timeline Lie. 15 documented sites across every Australian state where peer-reviewed research has quietly rewritten the history most of us were taught in school, using evidence that is decades old, fully verified, and still barely known outside academic circles. If a story like this genuinely surprises you, that book goes even deeper. The link is below the video if you'd like a look. Not a one-off. What makes this case so significant is that it is not an isolated fluke. Researchers studying Aboriginal oral tradition across Australia have identified a growing pattern of stories that appear to encode real, physically verifiable events reaching back much further than oral history was ever assumed capable of preserving. Separate studies have found Aboriginal accounts that accurately reflect sea level changes over the past 10,000 years, describing coastlines and landmarks that have since been drowned by rising water in exactly the places geological evidence says they once stood. In other cases, stories describing objects falling from the sky have led researchers straight to previously undocumented meteorite impact sites. The oral tradition functioning, in effect, as a map pointing toward physical evidence nobody else had thought to look for. There's a name now for this whole field of study: geomythology, the search for real geological events preserved inside traditional stories. And Australia has become one of its most important testing grounds precisely because the oldest continuous culture on Earth has been keeping records here in story and song and lore for tens of thousands of years. The most famous example is Budj Bim in Victoria, where the Gunditj Mara people's tradition describes a volcanic eruption that geologists have independently dated to around 37,000 years ago. Against a benchmark like that, a memory of the Atherton eruptions surviving 9 or 10,000 years stops looking impossible and starts looking like exactly what this kind of knowledge system is capable of. If you're finding this as remarkable as I am, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a deeper implication here that reaches far beyond 3 crater lakes. For most of the 20th century, Western academia treated oral tradition as inherently unreliable, assumed to drift, distort, and embellish with every retelling until any original factual core was hopelessly lost in accumulated myth. The Eacham, Barrine, and Euramoo stories challenge that assumption head-on. This is not a case of one vague detail loosely matching a known event. It is a story carrying multiple specific, independently verifiable physical details. A pre-eruption wind, ground shaking, an unnatural sky colour, and a precise final outcome, matched against sediment dating that places the Lake Eacham eruption at a little over 9,000 years before the present. An oral record stretching back that far, verified by physical science rather than merely assumed to be symbolic, sits well outside what most historical and anthropological frameworks were built to expect a purely spoken tradition could do. 2 ways of remembering one morning. The lakes are protected today within Crater Lakes National Park, part of the wet tropics of Queensland World Heritage Area. And to a modern visitor on the rainforest paths around Lake Eacham, absolutely nothing about that calm surface suggests any of this. Cassowaries move through the surrounding forest. Musky rat kangaroos, an unusually primitive little marsupial found almost nowhere else, and, unusually, active in daylight. Forage in the undergrowth. The whole scene reads as untouched, timeless rainforest, exactly the kind of place you'd photograph without a second thought about what the ground beneath you actually did and when. So what sits underneath these 3 lakes is not really a single unsolved mystery in the way some sites on this channel are. It is closer to a collision, a genuine meeting of 2 completely different systems for recording history. One built on drilled sediment cores and radiocarbon dating. The other built on memory, retelling, and a taboo about a sacred tree. And both arriving independently at the same violent morning around 9,000 years ago when the ground opened and swallowed a camp of people whole. It's worth being honest here, because this channel always tries to be. Not every Aboriginal story tied to a landmark carries this kind of precise, independently verified physical detail, and serious researchers are careful not to treat every piece of oral history as a literal geological transcript waiting to be decoded. What sets the Eacham, Barrine, and Euramoo accounts apart is the sheer specificity. Multiple independent physical details lining up with multiple independent scientific findings across 3 separate lakes, each with its own distinct version of the story matched to its own distinct eruption date. That level of consistency is what lifts this from an interesting coincidence into something scholars now treat as a genuine, serious example of deep-time oral history. One of the clearest on record anywhere in the world. 3 lakes, 3 eruptions, 3 stories. And the detail goes deeper than a single event. Lake Barrine carries a version of the same story adapted to its own timeline and scale, formed between 15 and 17,000 years ago, considerably earlier than Eacham. Barrine's eruption appears to have been larger and more extensive. That fits what geologists describe as an overall progression across this volcanic province. From bigger, more powerful eruptions in its earlier phases towards smaller, more localized events later, as the underlying magma system gradually lost its intensity over thousands of years. And here is the quietly astonishing part. That geological progression, tracked purely through physical evidence in the rock, is mirrored in the oral traditions themselves. The stories attached to each lake vary in scale and violence in a way that roughly matches the actual difference in size between the eruptions that made them. The bigger the real blast, the bigger the story. Lake Euramoo, the smallest of the 3, holds its own version too, centered on the same rainbow serpent growing angry and punishing those responsible. And the sediment cores drilled from Euramoo gave researchers something beyond just an eruption date. Its basal layers preserved evidence of a much drier climate during the early Holocene. Hardier, drought-tolerant vegetation growing here long before the dense wet rainforest that visitors see today ever took hold. And that, again, lines up with Aboriginal accounts describing a period of more open country in this same region long ago. Oral tradition and sediment science independently pointing to the same environmental history, layered on top of the eruption story itself. None of this needs a mystery invented around it, and it needs nothing supernatural to be extraordinary. There is no lost civilization here, no riddle. The plain truth is already staggering. That beneath 3 still, blue rainforest lakes lies the record of 3 ancient explosions, and that the people of this country witnessed them and remembered them and passed that memory down so faithfully that when scientists finally drilled into the mud thousands of years later, the rock and the story turned out to agree. The rainbow serpent was never just a monster in a tale. It was the shape a real and terrifying morning took in the memory of the oldest continuous culture on Earth, kept whole across 10,000 years and waiting the entire time in plain sight. If this changed how you think about the deep history of this country, leave it in the comments. And subscribe to Ancient Aussie History for more of the strange, ancient, and unresolved corners of this country hiding in plain sight.